Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre, slow-motion collapse into death of Henry VIII, the Tudor titan whose life was filled with wives, war, and very questionable decisions involving axes. Picture this. You're standing in the royal chambers of Whitehall Palace, watching a man who once wrestled opponents to the ground while composing poetry transform into what can only be described as a heavily decorated armchair with anger management issues. His legs are oozing fluid that smells like something you wouldn't serve at a medieval tavern. His meals could feed entire villages, and his coffin is about to leak royal decomposition all over the English countryside. Here's your reality check. If you think modern celebrities have embarrassing deaths, wait until you hear about a king whose funeral procession had to stop because dogs were licking the drippings from his coffin. Yes, that actually happened. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you placed a portrait of Henry VIII from 1520 next to one from 1545, you'd be forgiven for thinking they depicted two entirely different people. One an athletic heartthrob, the other what could generously be described as an ornate armchair with anger management issues and a crown. The England of the 1540s was experiencing its Renaissance golden age, with magnificent palaces like Whitehall and Greenwich serving as stages for the most powerful monarchy in Europe. This was an era when medical knowledge consisted largely of prayer, bloodletting, and the occasional helpful suggestion to try eating more meat, which Henry took as a personal challenge rather than dietary advice. The Tudor court operated under the belief that divine right extended to divine health, a theory that Henry's increasingly rebellious body seemed determined to disprove. Henry VIII stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, which in the 16th century made him a giant among men. In his youth, he had been the golden boy of European royalty, broad-shouldered, athletic, and capable of wrestling opponents to the ground while composing poetry and playing the lute. He could joust, hunt, dance until dawn, and still have energy left to execute a political rival before breakfast. But by his 50s, that magnificent frame had become something entirely different. A monument to excess that required architectural planning to move from room to room. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but when it came with the subtlety of a cannon blast. Henry's body had begun what historians politely call his decline, though what they really mean is that he had ballooned to over 300 pounds, mostly concentrated around his midsection like a royal bowling ball with arms. Every joint ached constantly. His infamous leg ulcers had begun their legendary career of tormenting both him and anyone unfortunate enough to stand downwind. And his general physical condition could best be described as aggressively deteriorating. Yet the image of the glorious king had to be maintained at all costs. Court painters continued to depict him as virile and broad-shouldered, with eyes that suggested divine purpose, rather than chronic indigestion. His tailor worked overtime, essentially becoming a Renaissance engineer tasked with making silk and velvet do things that defied both physics and good taste. One surviving report claims that Henry's final suit of armor required a waist measurement of 54 inches. And that's probably being diplomatic. The royal wardrobe had become less about fashion and more about structural engineering. Garments had to be reinforced, expanded, and occasionally redesigned mid-construction, as Henry's body continued its relentless expansion. Courtiers learned to maintain appropriate distances, not out of respect, but out of basic survival instinct, as the king's personal hygiene had become what diplomatic correspondents euphemistically described as noticeable. Behind the velvet and jewels, Henry was quite literally rotting, slowly and publicly, with a considerable budget dedicated to masking the evidence. Servants drew the short straw for what was delicately termed foot duty. Physicians tried everything from honey poultices to creative applications of rose oil, but most remedies produced the same result: expensive linen soaked in royal discharge. The moment of truth came sometime in his mid-40s, when Henry discovered that his body could no longer support his imperial ambitions. Mounting a horse, once as natural as breathing, now required a complex system of pulleys and what amounted to emotional bribery directed at both horse and rider. The magnificent destriers that had once carried him into glorious combat began to reassess their career choices when faced with hoisting the royal bulk into the saddle. Exercise, once the cornerstone of royal virility, became a distant memory replaced by mechanical solutions. Court engineers designed what was essentially a reinforced wheelchair disguised as a throne on training wheels, allowing Henry to be transported through his palaces with whatever dignity remained intact. His armor was refitted not for battle, but simply to support the sheer gravitational force of his presence. As Henry sank deeper into his chair, both literally and metaphorically, he began to understand that some battles cannot be won through royal decree. The throne that had once symbolized absolute power had become a prison, trapping a king who discovered too late that even divine authority has physical limitations, and that gravity, unlike his subjects, refused to bow. Foreign ambassadors visiting the Tudor court developed an unspoken rule when meeting Henry VIII: breathe through your mouth, never through your nose. The king's legs had become biological weapons, and the smell announced his arrival long before the royal trumpets did. In the private chambers of Whitehall Palace, where the royal physicians conducted their daily battles against decay, the air hung thick with the scent of honey, rose oil, and something far less pleasant that no amount of perfume could mask. This was an era when bathing was more theoretical than practical, when perfume served as health care, and when the most effective deodorant was standing upwind. But even by 16th century standards, Henry's aroma was remarkable, legendary even. The culprits were his legs, or more precisely, what had happened to them. What began as minor jousting injuries in his 30s had evolved into something that medical historians can only describe with clinical detachment: chronic, suppurating ulcers that refused to heal and constantly leaked fluid. These weren't mere wounds. They were caverns, festering gaps in the royal flesh that had become so deep you could allegedly see bone, wrapped in silk stockings and an emperor's worth of denial. Dr. William Butts and Dr. John Chamber, the royal physicians, approached their daily duties with the grim determination of men who understood they were fighting a war they could not win. Their patient was the most powerful man in England, which meant failure wasn't just professionally embarrassing, it could be fatal. They tried everything that 16th century medicine could offer, which unfortunately wasn't much: honey dressings, herbal compresses, and the time-honored tradition of lancing dominated their arsenal. The lancing procedure had become a daily ritual that would have broken lesser men. Every morning, a physician had to approach the throne and essentially announce, "Good morning, Your Majesty. I'm here to stab your legs again." The process involved draining the wounds with blades and cloths, a medieval version of wound care that was about as pleasant as it sounds. Several court doctors died young, and while official records cite various causes, modern observers might suspect trauma-related stress disorders. The stench was legendary. Courtiers learned to read the king's mood, not through facial expressions, but through olfactory intensity. The stronger the smell, the fouler the temper. Visitors commented on the odor from across the room, and ambassadors reportedly endured audiences while holding perfumed cloths to their faces, the Renaissance equivalent of hazmat protection. Even Henry's own clothing had to be burned after use, rather than washed, a fitting metaphor for how much of his dignity had become disposable. The servants assigned to foot duty remain nameless in historical records, but they deserve a moment of recognition for services above and beyond any reasonable job description. These individuals faced daily exposure to wounds so putrid that they could clear a room, all while maintaining the pretense that nothing unusual was happening. The turnover rate for these positions was, unsurprisingly, quite high. Henry's attempts to manage the situation bordered on the heroic and the ridiculous in equal measure. He essentially mummified himself in velvet and linen, hoping layers of rich fabric could absorb both the discharge and the shame. Perfume became less a luxury than a necessity, applied with the desperation of a man trying to mask a crime scene. The royal apartments were constantly fumigated with burning herbs, creating an atmosphere that was part palace, part apothecary, part funeral pyre. The psychological impact was devastating. Henry, once confident in his physical prowess, now had to negotiate with his own body for basic functions. Walking became a negotiation, sitting required careful positioning, and any sudden movement risked embarrassing leakage. The king, who had once inspired fear through martial prowess, now generated a different kind of apprehension, the social anxiety of being trapped in an enclosed space with someone whose personal ecosystem had gone catastrophically wrong. Yet somehow, the charade continued. Courtiers developed the diplomatic skill of pretending not to notice what was happening 3 feet away from them, while Henry maintained the fiction that he was merely experiencing a temporary inconvenience. His throne, once a symbol of absolute power, had become a carefully engineered containment system, upholstered with materials selected more for absorption than aesthetics. The breakfast menu for Henry VIII could have sustained a peasant family for a month, while his dinner menu could have fed an entire village. What had once been royal appetite had transformed into something approaching a consuming force of nature, and the royal kitchens had become less a culinary operation than a logistics challenge, involving industrial quantities of meat and the structural engineering of dining furniture. In the grand halls of Greenwich Palace, where hundreds of cooks labored over massive hearths that roared like dragon mouths, Henry's meals weren't just prepared, they were orchestrated. The Tudor court had long equated meat consumption with masculine power, operating under the theory that the more flesh appeared on your plate, the more divine authority you possessed. Henry, bless his increasingly expansive soul, had taken this philosophy as a personal mission statement rather than a serving suggestion. A typical morning feast might include several eggs, hunks of beef that required 2 hands to lift, white bread soaked in ale, and perhaps a roasted partridge just to aid digestion. Fruits and vegetables were present mainly as decoration or as accidental additions that had fallen onto the roast. The king's philosophy was elegantly simple. If it had once possessed a heartbeat, it belonged on his table. If it hadn't, it was probably useful for thickening something that did. Roasted swan, venison, lamb, eel pies, and game birds arrived at the royal table, coated in gravies, sauces, or symbolic meaning. Everything was swimming in some form of liquid fat, as if the cooks were attempting to achieve a perfect ratio of protein to grease that would satisfy both nutritional and engineering requirements. His favorite beverage was red wine, consumed in quantities that suggested Henry was attempting to achieve a blood alcohol content that could be measured in percentages rather than parts per million. The sheer scale of these meals defied rational explanation. Food was prepared in enormous quantities, not just for Henry, but for an entire royal household of taste testers, servers, musicians, and whatever courtiers happened to be in favor that week. But even accounting for the entourage, Henry ate as if every meal might be interrupted by the apocalypse. Spoiler alert, one eventually was, though not in the way he expected. His digestive system, meanwhile, had begun staging what could diplomatically be called protests. Royal physicians regularly documented his bloating, discomfort, and what historical records politely describe as audible distress. You could probably synchronize your pocket watch to the post-feast groans that echoed through Whitehall's corridors, a royal soundtrack that reminded everyone within earshot that even kings must answer to biology. As Henry's body expanded, practical dining became increasingly challenging. His rotting teeth made chewing difficult, forcing kitchen staff to pre-cut all food into manageable portions. Lifting a turkey leg had become an aerobic activity that required strategic planning and possibly a brief rest afterward. The king, who had once torn into roasted boar with his bare hands, now needed his meat diced like baby food, though served with considerably more ceremony. The dining chair itself had undergone structural modifications that would have impressed Renaissance engineers. What had once been a throne suitable for an athletic monarch had been reinforced, widened, and essentially rebuilt to accommodate a load-bearing capacity that furniture wasn't typically expected to handle. Cushions weren't just comfort items, they were architectural necessities designed to distribute weight and absorb the various fluids that Henry's body seemed determined to leak at inconvenient moments. Yet despite the obvious consequences of his dietary choices, Henry refused to modify his eating habits. This wasn't mere stubbornness. It was royal prerogative taken to its logical conclusion. If God had made him king, then surely divine providence would protect him from the consequences of royal excess. This theological approach to nutrition produced predictable results, but Henry seemed genuinely surprised each time his body failed to cooperate with his appetite. The transformation was visible to everyone, except, apparently, Henry himself. Courtiers learned to time conversations around digestive cycles, ambassadors planned meetings when the king wasn't actively groaning, and servants developed an entire system of communication based on stomach rumbles and their probable implications for royal mood. The king, who had once commanded armies with a gesture, now struggled to command his own body to remain upright after meals. His throne, serving less as a seat of power than as a carefully engineered life support system for a man who had declared war on moderation and was losing badly. In January 1547, predicting the death of the king was high treason, punishable by execution. So when Henry VIII was actually dying, nobody dared speak the truth, creating the surreal spectacle of an entire government pretending their monarch was simply having an extended nap. The royal bedchamber at Whitehall Palace had become a theater of the absurd, where England's most powerful courtiers performed the greatest acting challenge of their careers, convincing themselves and each other that the obviously dying king was merely indisposed. Tudor law made discussing the monarch's mortality a capital offense, which meant that as Henry's breathing grew more labored and his consciousness flickered like a candle in wind, his closest advisors were legally required to maintain the fiction that he was simply having a rough week. Henry VIII lay propped up in his massive bed, surrounded by embroidered cushions that had become less decorative accessories than medical equipment designed to keep him upright. His legendary bulk had rendered him essentially immobile. He hadn't walked in weeks, hadn't ridden in years, and spent his final days attempting to rule England from beneath a mountain of silk bedding and questionable decisions. His legs were so swollen that removing his stockings had become a two-person operation, requiring advanced planning and strategic breathing. Yet even as his body systematically shut down, Henry continued conducting business with the stubborn determination of a man who had never accepted that anything, including death, might dare to inconvenience him without permission. He signed documents with hands that shook like autumn leaves, amended his will with the meticulous attention of someone planning a very long vacation, and appointed a regency council for his 9-year-old son Edward, who was about to inherit a kingdom and a national debt that could bankrupt France. The courtiers had developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms to navigate the legal minefield of Henry's condition. "His Majesty is resting deeply," they would murmur to foreign ambassadors. "The king is in a reflective mood," they explained to concerned bishops. "His Grace is simply digesting vigorously," became the diplomatic way of explaining why audiences had been postponed indefinitely. Even the royal physicians tiptoed around the obvious, with one brave soul declaring, "His Majesty shall recover, God willing." A statement so vague and non-committal it could have been issued by a weather forecaster. Meanwhile, the subject of all this careful language was drifting in and out of consciousness, probably hallucinating about roast goose and Protestant theology in equal measure. His breathing had become labored enough that visitors could hear it from the corridor, but discussing this audible evidence of mortality remained strictly forbidden. Servants learned to interpret the rhythm of royal respiration like a Morse code of impending doom, while maintaining bright smiles and cheerful demeanor whenever questioned about the king's health. The psychological strain on everyone involved was enormous. Palace staff went about their duties knowing that their employer was dying while being legally prohibited from acknowledging this obvious fact. Foreign diplomats conducted negotiations with representatives of a king who might not survive the length of their meetings. The Privy Council made decisions for a realm whose ruler was increasingly unable to distinguish between waking and sleeping. But they had to pretend every royal grunt was a profound statement of policy. Even Henry's own body seemed confused by the legal requirements. His pulse grew weaker, his skin took on the pallor of expensive parchment, and his famous appetite dwindled to practically nothing. But officially, he was just having a moment of spiritual reflection. Priests hovered nearby, ostensibly for routine consultations, but actually waiting for someone to give them permission to perform last rites without committing treason in the process. As January dragged on, the entire court existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for someone to solve the impossible puzzle of how to announce that the king was dead without first admitting that he had been dying. The man who had rewritten English law to suit his personal convenience had created a legal framework that made his own death technically impossible to acknowledge, trapping his government in a bureaucratic nightmare that would have been hilarious if the stakes weren't so high. The silence grew heavier each day, broken only by the sound of Henry's increasingly irregular breathing and the nervous shuffling of courtiers who were all thinking the same forbidden thought but couldn't dare speak it aloud. When Henry VIII's coffin began its final journey from London to Windsor Castle, it carried more than just the remains of England's most infamous monarch. It carried a ticking biological time bomb that would turn a solemn royal funeral into the most embarrassing procession in British history. The royal handlers faced an immediate engineering challenge that no amount of ceremony could disguise. Henry's body was enormous, riddled with infections, and had been inadequately preserved using 16th century embalming techniques that consisted mainly of stuffing the corpse with spices and hoping for divine intervention. The plan was to transport the lead-lined wooden coffin with appropriate dignity to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where the king would be laid to rest next to Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a male heir and died before she could disappoint him. What nobody had calculated was how Henry's body would respond to the journey. The embalming process, rudimentary at best, had involved cramming the royal corpse with cinnamon, cloves, and whatever aromatic herbs the court apothecaries thought might overpower the scent of decay. The results were about as effective as you'd expect from a preservation method that was essentially medieval Tupperware filled with Christmas spices. The funeral procession began with appropriate solemnity, mourning nobles walking beside the ornate hearse, while maintaining the dignity expected of those bidding farewell to their sovereign. But somewhere between London and Windsor, the carefully sealed coffin began to exhibit behavior that coffins are definitely not supposed to display. The combination of internal gases, poor craftsmanship, and sheer biological momentum caused the wooden container to swell like a balloon and develop what could diplomatically be described as structural integrity issues. By the time the procession reached Sion Abbey for an overnight stop, a dark, putrid fluid had begun seeping from the base of the coffin. This wasn't the gentle weeping of wood grain. This was active leakage of royal decomposition, creating a trail that would have challenged even the most experienced crime scene cleanup crew. The smell, already noticeable inside the sealed container, now began to permeate the February air with an intensity that made horses nervous and humans nauseous. Then came the moment that would cement Henry's posthumous reputation for inappropriate behavior. Dogs appeared. According to contemporary accounts that historians have debated but never quite dismissed, stray dogs were seen licking the fluid that had pooled beneath the coffin during the overnight stop. Yes, England's former supreme head of the church was being consumed by opportunistic canines while his funeral procession tried to maintain ceremonial dignity. The handlers faced an impossible situation. They couldn't acknowledge what was happening without admitting that their preservation efforts had failed spectacularly. But they also couldn't continue the journey with a coffin that was actively malfunctioning. The solution involved a hasty cleaning operation conducted with a kind of frantic discretion that would have made a political scandal fixer proud. Rags were produced, surfaces were scrubbed, and everyone involved agreed to pretend that nothing unusual had occurred. The procession resumed with grim determination, mourning nobles maintaining their solemn expressions while privately calculating how quickly they could complete the journey before the situation deteriorated further. The coffin was reinforced as discreetly as possible. Additional sealing materials were applied, and the pace was increased to something approaching a royal death march rather than a ceremonial crawl. When the funeral party finally reached Windsor Castle, the burial was conducted with remarkable speed. Henry was interred in a simple vault beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel, sharing space with Jane Seymour in what amounted to a basement-level arrangement that would have horrified the king who had once planned a magnificent tomb to rival any pharaoh's pyramid. For over a century, Henry's final resting place bore no inscription, marked only by a plain stone slab that tourists walked over without realizing they were treading on one of history's most colorful monarchs. It wasn't until the Victorian era that someone added a proper memorial, as if the kingdom had needed time to process the embarrassment before officially acknowledging where their most infamous king had ended up. The man who had thundered across Europe wielding papal bulls and turkey legs in equal measure, who had rewritten religious doctrine and matrimonial law to suit his convenience, was buried like a moderately successful merchant, quietly, quickly, and with minimal fanfare, proving that even divine authority has its expiration date. Valeria Messalina didn't stumble into the spotlight. She was born in it, a member of the powerful Claudian dynasty with imperial blood coursing through her veins and a brain apparently pre-programmed for political manipulation. Her great-uncle was Emperor Tiberius, her cousin would one day become the notorious Nero, and her family tree read like a who's who of Roman power players, each branch heavy with ambition, paranoia, and an impressive collection of daggers, both literal and metaphorical. Rome in the early 1st century CE was a place where virtue was praised in public and discarded in private, where loyalty was a currency that could be inflated or devalued depending on political winds, and where a well-timed affair or alliance could mean the difference between a villa in Capri and a one-way trip to the executioner's block. This was the world that shaped young Messalina, a glittering metropolis built on marble foundations and sustained by carefully orchestrated betrayals. The Claudian household where Messalina grew up operated like a finishing school for future autocrats. Children learned to read facial expressions like military intelligence, to interpret silence as either agreement or plotting, and to understand that every family dinner was essentially a diplomatic summit with higher stakes than most international negotiations. Love was lovely in theory, but strategic marriages built empires, and empires built legacies that outlasted romantic poetry. Messalina possessed the kind of beauty that opened doors and closed rational thought in equal measure. But more dangerously, she had inherited the Claudian gift for seeing 3 moves ahead in games where most people were still figuring out the rules. While other noble daughters learned embroidery and household management, Messalina studied power, how it flowed, how it could be redirected, and most importantly, how it could be acquired by someone technically excluded from holding it directly. When she reached marriageable age, the family arranged her union with Tiberius Claudius Drusus, better known to history as the future Emperor Claudius. At the time, this seemed less like winning the marital lottery and more like being assigned to babysit the family embarrassment. Claudius was awkward, physically impaired, and widely considered the least likely member of his generation to achieve anything noteworthy. He stammered, he limped, and he had the social presence of a scholarly afterthought. Most young women of Messalina's caliber might have viewed marriage to Claudius as a cosmic joke or a punishment for unspecified crimes in a previous life. But Messalina saw something that others missed: potential. While her relatives dismissed Claudius as harmless and forgettable, she recognized that his very invisibility made him dangerous. People ignored him, which meant they spoke freely around him. They underestimated him, which meant they left him out of their conspiracies. In a family where everyone was plotting against everyone else, being overlooked might actually be the ultimate strategic advantage. The marriage proceeded with the kind of resigned efficiency that characterized most aristocratic unions. Property was exchanged, dowries were calculated, and 2 people who barely knew each other promised to create a politically advantageous household. Messalina entered the arrangement with plans that extended far beyond domestic tranquility. She had married not just a man, but an opportunity. Not just a husband, but a potential pathway to influence that could reshape the empire itself. While Claudius buried himself in historical research and administrative details, Messalina began the delicate work of building her own network within the imperial household. She cultivated friendships with freedmen, charmed influential senators' wives, and learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy that determined who ate dinner with whom and why that mattered. Every conversation was reconnaissance. Every social gathering was intelligence collection, and every smile was a calculated investment in future leverage. When Caligula's assassination in 41 CE suddenly thrust the reluctant Claudius onto the imperial throne, Messalina found herself transformed overnight from a minor aristocrat married to an academic footnote into the Empress of Rome. She was barely 25 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and now wielding influence that most men could only dream of acquiring. The golden serpent of ambition that had been coiled quietly in her heart since childhood was finally free to strike, and Rome would never be quite the same. Every night, Messalina slipped out of the imperial palace like a shadow with imperial ambitions. Claudius believed his young wife was attending prayer services or visiting sick relatives, acts of piety that seemed perfectly appropriate for an empress. In reality, she was conducting business, though not the kind that appeared on official palace schedules or in the minutes of Senate meetings. Rome in the 40s CE was a city where power flowed through bedrooms as much as through boardrooms, and Messalina had discovered that sexuality could be weaponized with surgical precision. The imperial palace during Claudius's reign operated under a veneer of scholarly respectability. The emperor spent his evenings writing histories and reforming legal codes while his wife supposedly occupied herself with traditional feminine pursuits. What Claudius didn't realize was that Messalina had turned adultery into a form of statecraft. Her nocturnal expeditions took her to the Subura, Rome's most notorious district, where she would disguise herself as an ordinary prostitute and work alongside professional courtesans in the city's lupanaria. Ancient sources, admittedly written by men with various axes to grind, describe her competing with seasoned professionals to see who could service more clients in a single evening. Whether these accounts represent literal truth or scandalous propaganda matters less than what they reveal about how completely Messalina had shattered every expectation of imperial dignity. But these weren't random adventures in sexual liberation. They were strategic operations disguised as debauchery. Messalina's lovers weren't chosen for their physical attractions alone. They were carefully selected for their political utility. Senators found themselves in her bed, not because of their charm, but because of their voting records. Wealthy equestrians discovered that intimate access to the empress came with certain expectations about future financial support for imperial projects. Even foreign dignitaries learned that diplomatic success in Rome might require very personal negotiations. The empress had essentially created an intelligence network that operated through pillow talk, gathering information that would have made professional spies envious. Men who would never reveal state secrets in the Senate forum found themselves sharing confidential details while tangled in silk sheets with a woman they believed was just another talented courtesan. Messalina learned about military movements, financial transactions, family scandals, and political alliances, while her partners thought they were merely enjoying recreational adultery with an unusually well-connected prostitute. Claudius, meanwhile, remained either blissfully unaware or willfully ignorant of his wife's nocturnal career. His days were filled with administrative duties, judicial hearings, and scholarly pursuits that left him genuinely exhausted by evening. Some historians suggest that Messalina manipulated him by playing the role of the concerned, devoted wife who understood his intellectual pressures and never bothered him with trivial complaints about feeling neglected. Others believe he simply didn't want to know. Acknowledging the truth would have shattered his illusions about both his marriage and his control over the imperial household. The whispers in Rome's forums, bathhouses, and marketplace grew louder with each passing month. Citizens exchanged knowing looks when the empress's name came up in conversation. Vendors made crude jokes about imperial nightlife, and even foreign visitors heard stories about the remarkable talents of a mysterious woman who appeared in the red light district whenever the moon was dark. Messalina's reputation became the kind of open secret that everyone discussed, and no one dared mention officially. Yet she felt untouchable, protected by her position and her husband's apparent indifference to palace gossip. The power intoxicated her more than wine. She could ruin careers with a whispered suggestion, elevate loyalists with strategic recommendations, and eliminate rivals by sharing their secrets with their enemies. She had transformed the empress's traditional role from ceremonial figurehead into something approaching shadow government, pulling strings that moved senators, generals, and ministers like pieces on a board game only she understood. The golden serpent of her ambition had learned to move through Rome's shadows, striking with precision and retreating before anyone could identify the source of their downfall. But serpents, no matter how clever, eventually encounter creatures immune to their venom. And in the imperial household, Messalina was about to discover that some enemies prefer to hunt in daylight where everyone can see the kill. Narcissus had once been property, a slave whose very existence belonged to someone else. But now he was the most powerful freedman in Rome, and he was sharpening his knives for an empress who had forgotten that former slaves remember what it feels like to be disposable. In his private office adjacent to the imperial apartments, Narcissus managed the flow of information that kept the Roman Empire functioning. As Claudius's personal secretary and confidant, he controlled access to the emperor, filtered correspondence from across the known world, and maintained the delicate balance of relationships that prevented the government from collapsing into chaos. His rise from slavery to influence represented the kind of social mobility that Rome occasionally permitted but never celebrated, and it had taught him lessons about power that freeborn aristocrats never learned. Narcissus understood something that Messalina, in her imperial arrogance, had overlooked. Real power belonged to those who controlled information, not those who merely possessed titles. While the empress played her games of seduction and manipulation, he quietly catalogued every indiscretion, documented every suspicious alliance, and maintained files that could destroy careers with the efficiency of a well-aimed dagger. His network of informants included servants, freedmen, and minor officials whose loyalty he had purchased, not with gold, but with respect, a currency that Messalina had never bothered to understand. For years, Narcissus had tolerated the empress's adventures with the patient calculation of a man who understood that timing was everything in Roman politics. He watched her nocturnal expeditions, noted her strategic adultery, and observed how she used sexual leverage to build political influence. Part of him admired her audacity. It took considerable skill to transform prostitution into statecraft. But he also recognized that her recklessness was becoming dangerous, not just to herself, but to the stability of the empire he served. The tension between them had been building like pressure in a volcanic mountain, invisible to casual observers, but increasingly volatile to anyone who understood the geological forces at work. Messalina viewed Narcissus as a useful tool, a competent administrator who could be manipulated like any other member of the imperial household. She had tried to win his cooperation through a combination of charm and implied threats, assuming that his freedman status made him naturally subservient to her aristocratic authority. But Narcissus had learned patience from years of slavery and cunning from decades of survival in the imperial court. He knew that freedmen who challenged empresses directly tended to suffer unfortunate accidents or sudden career reversals. So instead of confronting Messalina openly, he began building a case against her with the methodical precision of a man who understood that accusations against imperial family members required ironclad evidence and perfect timing. His investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond personal scandal. Messalina wasn't just having affairs. She was essentially operating a shadow government that threatened the foundations of imperial authority. Her network of lovers included men who controlled military units, managed provincial finances, and influenced judicial decisions. She had created a parallel power structure that answered to her rather than to Claudius, and she was using it to eliminate rivals, enrich allies, and advance her own political agenda. The breaking point came when Messalina began targeting Narcissus himself. She had started making subtle suggestions to Claudius about the dangers of relying too heavily on freedmen, hinting that perhaps the emperor needed advisors from more traditional aristocratic backgrounds. Her attacks were couched in language about dignity and propriety, but Narcissus recognized them for what they were, an attempt to remove the one person in the imperial household who posed a genuine threat to her operations. In that moment, Narcissus understood that his choice was binary: destroy Messalina or be destroyed by her. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no peaceful coexistence. The Empress had made the classic mistake of powerful people throughout history. She had assumed that her position made her invulnerable, that her imperial status granted her immunity from consequences. But Narcissus had been a slave, and slaves learn that survival depends on understanding exactly when the master's protection ends and your own cunning begins. The golden serpent had finally encountered her mongoose, a creature that was immune to her venom and specifically adapted to hunt her species. The game was about to begin in earnest, and only one of them would survive to see its conclusion. Messalina married Gaius Silius in a public ceremony attended by hundreds of witnesses, complete with wedding feast, ceremonial toasts, and traditional Roman rituals. There was just one small problem. She was already married to the Emperor of Rome, a detail that transformed what might have been a private scandal into an act of treason so brazen it left even her enemies speechless. The gardens of Lucullus provided the setting for what would become the most audacious political miscalculation in Roman history. While Claudius was away inspecting the harbor at Ostia, Messalina had decided to celebrate her union with Gaius Silius, a handsome senator 20 years her junior, who possessed both significant wealth and dangerous political ambitions. Whether this represented the ultimate expression of romantic passion or the final phase of a carefully planned coup remains one of history's great mysteries. But either way, it was about to become a masterclass in how to destroy an empire in a single afternoon. Gaius Silius was everything that Claudius was not: young, athletic, charismatic, and possessed of the kind of natural authority that made soldiers follow him into battle and women follow him into bedchambers. He had been rising steadily through the ranks of Roman politics, accumulating both wealth and influence, with the kind of calculated ambition that characterized successful senators. His affair with Messalina had been an open secret for months, but marriage elevated their relationship from scandalous entertainment to existential threat. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted with all the solemnity and legal precision that Roman law required. Guests included senators, wealthy merchants, and various members of the aristocracy who either supported the union or were too terrified to refuse the invitation. Wine flowed, sacrifices were offered to the appropriate gods, and the couple exchanged vows that would have been perfectly legal if one of them hadn't already been married to the most powerful man in the known world. Messalina seemed genuinely convinced that she could manage the political fallout from her bigamous marriage through a combination of charm, manipulation, and strategic elimination of inconvenient witnesses. She had spent years believing that her beauty and intelligence made her untouchable, that her position as empress granted her immunity from consequences, and that Claudius's apparent passivity meant she could essentially rewrite the rules of imperial marriage to suit her personal preferences. But news of the wedding spread through Rome with the velocity that only truly shocking gossip can achieve. Servants whispered to other servants, guests confided in friends who confided in enemies, and by sunset, the entire city was buzzing with speculation about what the Empress had actually done and what it might mean for everyone involved. This wasn't private adultery that could be managed through discreet payments and strategic silence. This was public bigamy that challenged the fundamental authority of the imperial household. Narcissus received the intelligence within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, and for the first time in his political career, he found himself genuinely stunned by the magnitude of someone else's stupidity. Messalina had handed him the perfect weapon for her destruction. Evidence so overwhelming and public that even Claudius's legendary tolerance for marital irregularities couldn't rationalize it away. She had essentially committed treason in front of hundreds of witnesses who could provide testimony that would satisfy even the most skeptical judge. The freedman moved with the efficiency of a man who understood that opportunities like this appeared maybe once in a lifetime. He dispatched urgent messages to Claudius at Ostia, assembled evidence from witnesses still sobering up from the wedding feast, and began coordinating with the Praetorian Guard to ensure that both Messalina and Silius could be arrested before they realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. Meanwhile, in the gardens of Lucullus, the newlyweds celebrated their union with the kind of euphoric confidence that precedes spectacular disasters. Messalina had finally achieved what she believed was the perfect combination of love and power, a husband who excited her passions and possessed the political strength to support her ambitions. She had no idea that her wedding night was about to become the last night of her life, or that the golden serpent of her ambition had finally bitten something poisonous enough to kill her. After Messalina's execution, Claudius ordered her name stricken from official records, her statues pulled down, and her inscriptions defaced. But erasing a legend proved considerably more difficult than eliminating the woman who had created it. Rome was instructed to forget its empress, yet the city whispered about her more intensely now that she was gone, as if death had transformed scandal into mythology. The political cleanup following Messalina's fall was swift and merciless. Gaius Silius, caught mid-celebration at his own wedding feast, was dragged into the street and executed without trial, his dreams of imperial power ending before he could fully comprehend what had happened. His supporters, those who had lent encouragement to what they thought was a romantic adventure, found themselves rounded up in a brutal sweep that demonstrated how quickly political association could become a death sentence in imperial Rome. Claudius, publicly stoic in the aftermath of his wife's betrayal, had transformed overnight from a seemingly passive ruler into something resembling the paranoid autocrat his family lineage suggested he might always have been. The man who had tolerated years of marital humiliation now began purging his court with surgical precision, removing anyone who had shown excessive loyalty to Messalina or insufficient horror at her treachery. Freedmen who had once dined at imperial banquets found themselves exiled or executed, their crime being too closely associated with the fallen empress. The most tragic victim of Messalina's downfall was her young son Britannicus, who had been transformed overnight from heir to the empire into a living reminder of his mother's disgrace. Claudius couldn't bring himself to punish the boy for his mother's sins, but neither could he ignore the political complications that Britannicus represented. The child's very existence served as evidence of Messalina's brief period of legitimate influence, making him simultaneously precious and dangerous in the volatile atmosphere of post-scandal Rome. Into this power vacuum stepped Agrippina the Younger, a woman who had observed Messalina's rise and fall with the calculating attention of someone planning to avoid similar mistakes. Where Messalina had been reckless, Agrippina was methodical. Where the former empress had relied on passion and charm, her replacement deployed strategy and patience. Agrippina understood that the key to lasting power lay not in dramatic gestures, but in careful manipulation of succession politics. The marriage negotiations between Claudius and Agrippina proceeded with the kind of careful diplomacy usually reserved for international treaties. She presented herself as the solution to all of Claudius's problems, a mature woman who could restore dignity to the imperial household, a mother whose son Nero could provide stability for the succession, and most importantly, someone who understood that an empress's role was to support rather than supplant her husband's authority. It was a masterful performance that convinced Claudius he was choosing safety when he was actually selecting an even more dangerous predator. Agrippina's ascension to power marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to erase not just Messalina's memory, but her son's future. Britannicus, once the undisputed heir to the empire, found himself gradually marginalized as Nero was adopted, renamed, and positioned as Claudius's preferred successor. The boy, who had been born into imperial privilege, discovered that his mother's reputation had made him politically radioactive, a living obstacle to Agrippina's ambitions. When Claudius died under mysterious circumstances in 54 CE, possibly poisoned by Agrippina, though the evidence remains circumstantial, Nero ascended to the throne, while Britannicus was relegated to the shadows. The transition was so smooth that it seemed almost inevitable, a testament to Agrippina's superior political skills and her understanding that lasting power required eliminating not just current rivals but potential future threats. Britannicus's death during a dinner party the following year, officially attributed to an epileptic seizure but widely suspected to be poison administered on Nero's orders, marked the final erasure of Messalina's bloodline from imperial succession. The Golden Serpent was truly dead now, her legacy reduced to cautionary tales whispered in the corners of the palace she had once ruled. Yet even as Rome tried to forget Messalina, her story had become embedded in the empire's DNA. She had demonstrated that empresses could wield real power, that sexuality could be transformed into statecraft, and that even the most carefully constructed political systems remained vulnerable to individual ambition. Her ghost would linger in every subsequent imperial marriage, a reminder that behind every throne stood someone planning either to protect it or to claim it for themselves. Alexander Hamilton could design a financial system for an entire nation, negotiate complex international treaties, and co-author the Federalist Papers, but he apparently couldn't resist a beautiful woman crying on his doorstep, asking for help. It was a summer evening in 1791 when Maria Reynolds appeared at his Philadelphia home, and with that single visit, America's first Secretary of the Treasury began writing the opening chapter of the country's first major political sex scandal. Philadelphia in the 1790s was a city where everyone knew everyone else's business, largely because the federal government was small enough that you could fit most of the important players in a single tavern and still have room for a decent card game. Hamilton was at the absolute peak of his political power. Having successfully established the nation's credit, created the first national bank, and proven that a former orphan from the Caribbean could become indispensable to George Washington's administration. His financial genius had quite literally saved the new republic from bankruptcy, and his political influence rivaled that of any man in America except Washington himself. Into this world of careful political calculation walked Maria Reynolds, a 23-year-old woman whose husband had allegedly abandoned her, leaving her destitute and desperate in a city where a woman alone had few options for survival. She was beautiful in the way that stopped conversations in crowded rooms, with the kind of distressed elegance that suggested both breeding and recent misfortune. Her story was simple. James Reynolds had deserted her. She had no money, no family support, and nowhere to turn except to the charity of prominent men who might take pity on her situation. Hamilton, despite his reputation for brilliant political calculation, proved remarkably susceptible to what would later be recognized as one of the oldest confidence games in human history. Perhaps it was Maria's tears, perhaps it was his own ego being flattered by her request for help, or perhaps it was simply that a man who spent his days wrestling with national debt and international trade agreements found the immediate, personal nature of her crisis irresistibly compelling. Whatever the reason, he agreed to help her financially and arranged to deliver the money personally to her lodgings. The meeting that was supposed to be a simple act of charity became something considerably more complicated when Maria made it clear that her gratitude extended beyond mere words. Hamilton, who had built his career on calculating risks and managing complex negotiations, found himself utterly unprepared for a seduction that combined genuine need with strategic calculation. The encounter left him simultaneously exhilarated and terrified, aware that he had crossed a line that could destroy everything he had worked to build. What followed was a year-long affair that demonstrated how even the most intellectually gifted men can make spectacularly poor decisions when their judgment is clouded by passion and ego. Hamilton began visiting Maria regularly, bringing money for her supposed financial difficulties, while conducting a relationship that grew increasingly intimate and emotionally complex. He convinced himself that he was helping a woman in genuine distress, while satisfying desires that his marriage to Elizabeth Schuyler, however politically advantageous, had apparently left unfulfilled. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely as a private matter between consenting adults, except for one crucial detail that Hamilton had failed to consider. Maria Reynolds had a husband, and James Reynolds was very much alive, very much aware of what was happening, and very much interested in turning his wife's affair into a profitable enterprise. When James Reynolds discovered the relationship, his response wasn't the explosive rage that might have been expected from a cuckolded husband. Instead, he displayed the calm calculation of a businessman who had just identified a lucrative opportunity. Rather than challenging Hamilton to a duel or exposing the affair publicly, Reynolds proposed a more creative solution. Hamilton could continue seeing Maria, and Reynolds would continue pretending not to notice, provided that Hamilton compensated him for this extraordinary understanding with regular financial payments. It was blackmail dressed up as a gentleman's agreement, and Hamilton found himself trapped in a situation where paying hush money seemed like the only way to preserve both his political career and his personal reputation. For more than a year, Hamilton made regular payments to James Reynolds while continuing his relationship with Maria, creating a bizarre triangle of adultery, extortion, and mutual dependence that would have challenged even the most creative fiction writer's imagination. The future author of America's financial system was being systematically milked by a pair of con artists who had transformed seduction into a sustainable business model. Thomas Jefferson penned the immortal words, "All men are created equal," while simultaneously maintaining a household where some of those men remained his property. And in the most personal contradiction of his life, he was raising children who would never be acknowledged as his own, despite bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the author of the Declaration of Independence. The relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings began in the most morally complex circumstances imaginable during Jefferson's diplomatic service in Paris in the late 1780s. Sally had accompanied Jefferson's daughter Mary as a companion and servant, but the young woman who crossed the Atlantic was more than just another enslaved person in the Jefferson household. She was the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife, Martha, the daughter of John Wales and an enslaved woman named Betty Hemings. The genetic irony was inescapable. Jefferson was developing a relationship with a woman who shared bloodline with his late wife, creating layers of complexity that would have challenged even the most sophisticated moral philosopher. Sally Hemings was approximately 14 years old when the relationship began, while Jefferson in his 40s and serving as America's minister to France. The power imbalance was absolute and undeniable. She was his property in every legal sense, with no right to refuse his advances, no legal recourse if she objected, and no social protection from a man who literally owned her existence. Yet Paris offered a tantalizing glimpse of a different world, where slavery was illegal, and Sally could theoretically claim her freedom simply by refusing to return to Virginia. The choice she faced was impossible by any reasonable standard. Remain in France as a free woman, but abandon her family forever, or return to Virginia and accept a relationship with Jefferson that might offer her children opportunities unavailable to other enslaved people. According to family oral history preserved by her descendants, Sally negotiated what amounted to a private treaty with Jefferson. She would return to Monticello if he promised that their children would be freed when they reached adulthood. A remarkable agreement that suggested she possessed both intelligence and negotiating skills that transcended her legal status. Back at Monticello, Sally became part of the intricate hierarchy that characterized Jefferson's plantation world. She worked as a seamstress and domestic servant, occupying quarters close to the main house that allowed for discretion while maintaining the fiction that their relationship didn't exist. Jefferson's meticulous record-keeping documented Sally's pregnancies and the births of their children with the same clinical precision he applied to agricultural experiments, noting dates and details while carefully avoiding any written acknowledgement of paternity. The children of this relationship, Madison, Eston, Harriet, and Beverly, among others, grew up in the strange liminal space between slavery and freedom, treated differently from other enslaved people on the plantation, but never officially recognized as Jefferson's offspring. They received privileges that other enslaved children didn't enjoy: education, training in valuable skills, and the implicit understanding that they would eventually be freed. Yet they also lived with the daily reminder that their father was simultaneously their master, their protector, and the man who could sell them at any moment if circumstances changed. The scandal first became public in 1802 when James Callender, a disgruntled former Jefferson supporter, published allegations about the relationship in a Richmond newspaper. The charges were explosive: that the author of American Liberty was keeping a concubine and had fathered multiple children with an enslaved woman. Jefferson's political enemies seized on the story with glee, while his supporters either denied the allegations or argued that his private life was irrelevant to his public service. Jefferson himself never publicly acknowledged the relationship or his children with Sally Hemings, maintaining a silence that became one of the most psychologically complex aspects of his character. He freed Sally's children as they reached adulthood, some through formal manumission, others by allowing them to simply walk away from Monticello without pursuit. But he never freed Sally herself during his lifetime, though she was granted her freedom by Jefferson's daughter after his death. The DNA evidence that emerged in the 1990s confirmed what oral tradition had maintained for 2 centuries. Jefferson had indeed fathered children with Sally Hemings, creating a secret family that lived in the shadows of Monticello for decades. The revelation forced Americans to confront the contradiction between their founder's lofty ideals and his personal compromises, between the man who proclaimed that slavery was holding a wolf by the ears, and the man who never let go of that wolf, even in his most intimate relationships. Benjamin Franklin arrived in London as America's diplomatic representative, with a reputation for scientific genius and folksy wisdom. But what the British public didn't know was that their distinguished colonial visitor was about to immerse himself in secret societies that would have scandalized his Puritan ancestors and provided enough gossip to fuel drawing-room conversations for decades. London in the 1750s and 1760s was experiencing an intellectual renaissance that blended Enlightenment philosophy with what polite society euphemistically called libertine exploration. The city's elite had grown bored with conventional morality and were experimenting with clubs and societies that challenged traditional religious and social boundaries. Into this atmosphere walked Franklin, ostensibly representing Pennsylvania's interests, but privately fascinated by the philosophical and personal freedoms that London offered to a man of his stature and curiosity. The most notorious of these organizations was the Hellfire Club, founded by Sir Francis Dashwood and officially known as the Knights of St. Francis of Wycombe. While historians debate the extent of Franklin's involvement, contemporary evidence suggests he was at minimum a frequent guest at their gatherings, which took place in caves beneath Dashwood's estate and featured rituals that parodied Christian ceremonies while celebrating what they termed natural philosophy. The club's motto, "Do what thou wilt," encapsulated an approach to morality that would have horrified the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but apparently appealed to Franklin's experimental nature. Franklin's attraction to these gatherings wasn't purely hedonistic. He genuinely believed that conventional morality often contradicted human nature, and that studying behavior outside traditional constraints could yield valuable insights about psychology and society. His scientific mind was drawn to what he considered experiments in human nature, though these experiments involved considerably more wine, elaborate costumes, and behavior that would have required extensive confession in any respectable church. The ceremonies at Medmenham Abbey, Dashwood's renovated monastery, combined mock religious rituals with intellectual discourse and activities that contemporary accounts describe with the kind of elaborate euphemisms that suggest everyone involved knew exactly what was happening, but preferred not to spell it out in writing. Franklin participated with the enthusiasm of a man who had spent too many years in Philadelphia, pretending to be more virtuous than he actually felt, relishing the opportunity to explore aspects of human behavior that American colonial society strictly prohibited. Beyond the Hellfire Club, Franklin's London social life included salons hosted by sophisticated women who appreciated his wit and were charmed by his deliberately cultivated image as an American primitive who possessed unexpected depths. His correspondence reveals relationships that were intellectually intimate, and probably physically so, though he maintained enough discretion to avoid the kind of scandal that could have ended his diplomatic career. His famous essay, Old Mistress's Apologue, written during this period, offered advice on the advantages of older women as lovers, with a frankness that would have been impossible to publish under his own name in America. Franklin also developed a fascination with codes, pseudonyms, and secret communication that went far beyond diplomatic necessity. He published controversial essays under false names, experimented with invisible inks, and maintained correspondence networks that allowed him to express ideas about religion, sexuality, and politics that would have been dangerous to voice publicly. His London years revealed a man who was simultaneously the practical American diplomat and a sophisticated European intellectual, comfortable with moral ambiguity. The transformation was remarkable. The Benjamin Franklin who had published Poor Richard's Almanac with its homespun moral lessons was the same man attending gatherings where participants wore monks' robes while engaging in activities that would have horrified actual monks. Yet Franklin seemed to compartmentalize these experiences with remarkable psychological dexterity, maintaining his public image as a wise, moral leader while privately exploring philosophical territory that challenged every conventional assumption about virtue and human nature. When Franklin finally returned to America in 1775, he brought with him not just diplomatic experience, but knowledge of human nature that his fellow revolutionaries couldn't have imagined. His understanding of power, psychology, and the gap between public morality and private behavior would prove invaluable during the Constitutional Convention. Though the delegates who trusted his wisdom had no idea that some of it had been acquired in underground chambers while wearing ceremonial robes and participating in rituals that parodied everything their Puritan ancestors had held sacred. The Franklin who helped design American democracy, was a far more complex and morally adventurous figure than the kindly grandfather of popular mythology. A man who understood that human nature included drives and curiosities that couldn't be eliminated by legislation or religious instruction. George Washington never told a lie about a cherry tree, according to the mythology, but he spent most of his adult life systematically destroying letters that might have revealed the truth about his heart, leaving behind a carefully curated legacy that transformed a complex, passionate man into a marble statue of Republican virtue. The real Washington was a creature of fierce appetites and deeper insecurities than his public image suggested. A man who understood that becoming a national symbol required sacrificing personal authenticity on the altar of political necessity. Behind the powdered wig and military bearing lived someone who wrestled with desires that could never be publicly acknowledged, doubts that could never be expressed, and a loneliness that increased proportionally with his public adoration. His first and perhaps most enduring passion was for Sally Fairfax, the wife of his close friend and neighbor, George William Fairfax. The relationship began when Washington was a young surveyor in his 20s, socially ambitious but financially insecure, desperately seeking acceptance among Virginia's plantation aristocracy. Sally was everything he admired: sophisticated, witty, well-connected, and completely unavailable. She was also married to a man Washington genuinely liked and respected, creating a triangle of affection, desire, and guilt that would haunt him for decades. The letters between Washington and Sally, those that survived his later purges, reveal a man capable of poetic longing and emotional vulnerability that his public persona never displayed. He wrote to her of dreams and aspirations, seeking her advice on matters both practical and personal, and developing a correspondence that walked the fine line between appropriate friendship and dangerous intimacy. The subtext was unmistakable. Washington was desperately in love with a woman he could never have, and she was fond enough of him to encourage the attention without ever crossing lines that would have destroyed both their reputations. When Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, it was a union that solved multiple problems simultaneously. It provided him with substantial wealth, social position, and a respectable wife who could manage the domestic aspects of his increasingly public life. But it was also a marriage of convenience that never quite developed into the kind of passionate partnership that his correspondence with Sally had suggested he craved. Martha was practical, capable, and utterly reliable, but the surviving evidence suggests their relationship was more collegial than romantic, built on mutual respect rather than consuming desire. The burden of becoming America's indispensable man only increased Washington's emotional isolation. As commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he couldn't afford to show doubt or vulnerability, even to his closest associates. As president, he understood that every action would be scrutinized for precedent, every word analyzed for meaning that extended far beyond his personal intentions. The role required him to become a living symbol of Republican virtue, which meant suppressing aspects of his personality that might complicate that image. His famous temper, carefully hidden from public view, occasionally erupted in private moments that terrified his subordinates. Aides recorded instances when Washington's rage at military setbacks or political frustrations exploded into profanity-laced tirades that would have shocked Americans who knew him only through formal portraits and ceremonial appearances. These outbursts revealed a man under enormous pressure, struggling to maintain superhuman composure while dealing with very human frustrations. Perhaps most tellingly, Washington spent his final years systematically destroying personal correspondence that might have revealed too much about his inner life. He burned letters from Martha, eliminated most traces of his early relationship with Sally Fairfax, and carefully edited his legacy to remove evidence of the doubts, desires, and contradictions that had shaped his character. The man who became known for his honesty had decided that some truths were too dangerous to preserve. The psychological cost of this self-censorship was enormous. Washington lived his final decades as a prisoner of his own legend, unable to express opinions or emotions that might tarnish the mythology he had helped create. He had successfully transformed himself from a flawed, passionate human being into a symbol of American virtue, but the price was the erasure of almost everything that had made him genuinely interesting. Even his decision to free his enslaved workers in his will, while morally admirable, was carefully timed to avoid the political complications that would have resulted from emancipation during his lifetime. Washington had learned to calculate even his moral gestures for maximum symbolic impact, while minimizing personal risk, demonstrating how completely he had subordinated his private conscience to his public image. The Founding Fathers created a nation based on perfect ideals while being imperfect humans themselves. And perhaps that contradiction, rather than diminishing their achievement, actually makes it more remarkable, proving that flawed people can still build something greater than the sum of their individual weaknesses. Modern America's relationship with its founders has evolved from unquestioning hero worship to something more complex and honest, a reckoning with the reality that the men who established the world's most successful democracy were also products of their time, who made moral compromises that seem inexcusable by contemporary standards. The DNA evidence confirming Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, the detailed documentation of Hamilton's affair and subsequent blackmail, and the gradual revelation of other founding-era scandals have forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their political saints were also very human sinners. This revelation has triggered what historians call the humanization of American mythology, a process that began in earnest during the Civil Rights Movement when activists pointed out the obvious contradiction between founding principles and founding practices regarding slavery, women's rights, and economic equality. The discovery that Jefferson fathered children with an enslaved woman wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a fundamental challenge to the narrative of American exceptionalism that had sustained national identity for 2 centuries. Yet the more we learn about the founders' personal failings, the more impressive their political achievements become. Hamilton's financial genius wasn't diminished by his marital infidelity. If anything, it becomes more remarkable that a man capable of such personal recklessness could design monetary systems of enduring sophistication. Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration of Independence doesn't become less significant because he failed to live up to its principles in his private life. Rather, it suggests that even hypocrites can occasionally articulate truths that transcend their personal limitations. The real lesson emerging from these revelations isn't that the founders were frauds, but that they were human beings wrestling with the same conflicts between ideals and appetites that challenge every generation. Washington's decision to sacrifice personal happiness for public duty, however psychologically costly, demonstrated a kind of moral courage that's arguably more admirable than the untested virtue of someone who never faced such choices. Franklin's ability to compartmentalize his libertine adventures while contributing genuine wisdom to constitutional deliberations reveals a complexity of character that makes him more interesting, not less trustworthy. Even their moral compromises, viewed in historical context, often represented steps toward justice rather than retreats from it. Jefferson's failure to free his enslaved workers during his lifetime was morally indefensible, but his inclusion of anti-slavery language in early drafts of the Declaration and his support for restricting slavery's expansion demonstrated an awareness that the institution contradicted American principles. Hamilton's opposition to slavery was more consistent, but his willingness to compromise on the issue for the sake of national unity revealed the practical political calculations that made the Constitution possible. The founders' greatest achievement may have been creating a system of government that could eventually transcend their own limitations. The Constitution they designed contained mechanisms for amendment and interpretation that allowed future generations to fulfill promises the founders themselves couldn't or wouldn't keep. The Declaration's assertion that all men are created equal became a weapon in the hands of abolitionists, suffragettes, and civil rights activists who used founding principles to challenge founding practices. Perhaps most importantly, the founders' flaws remind modern Americans that democracy isn't a gift from perfect leaders, but an ongoing project that requires constant vigilance and improvement. Their personal contradictions, Jefferson the slaveholder proclaiming equality, Hamilton the adulterer preaching virtue, Washington the ambitious man claiming to serve reluctantly, mirror the contradictions that persist in American society today. The true legacy of the founding generation isn't their moral perfection, but their intellectual honesty about human nature, and their creation of institutions designed to channel human ambition toward public good rather than private gain. They understood that people would be selfish, passionate, and corrupt, so they built a system with checks and balances that could function despite these inevitable failings. In the end, learning about the founders' secrets doesn't destroy American ideals. It reveals how those ideals emerged from very human struggles with very human weaknesses. The letters they wrote, the affairs they conducted, and the compromises they made remind us that democracy isn't the achievement of saints, but the ongoing work of flawed people trying, however imperfectly, to build something better than themselves. Napoleon Bonaparte could conquer half of Europe, command armies across continents, and reshape the political map of the Western world. But he was utterly defenseless against the indifference of one woman whose love he craved more than any military victory. And the letters he wrote from battlefields reveal not the voice of an emperor, but of a man completely undone by unrequited passion. The romance began in Paris in 1795, when Napoleon was still an ambitious young artillery officer with grandiose dreams but limited prospects. And Josephine de Beauharnais was a sophisticated widow 6 years his senior, who had survived the terror by adapting to each political wind with the grace of someone who understood that survival in revolutionary France required constant reinvention. She was everything he was not: socially polished, sexually experienced, and connected to the Parisian elite who could advance his career or destroy it depending on their whims. Their courtship was brief and intense, conducted in the hothouse atmosphere of post-revolutionary Paris, where yesterday's enemies became today's lovers, and political fortunes changed with the speed of guillotine blades. Napoleon fell completely and immediately, overwhelmed by Josephine's sophisticated charm and the promise of social acceptance that marriage to her represented. She was more calculating, recognizing in the young general a man whose ambition might carry them both to heights that her first marriage had never approached. Within months of their wedding in March 1796, Napoleon departed for his Italian campaign, beginning a separation that would reveal the fundamental asymmetry of their relationship through the most passionate and desperate love letters in military history. From the battlefields of northern Italy, where he was systematically defeating the Austrian Empire and establishing his reputation as a military genius, Napoleon poured out his soul in letters that transformed conquest into confession. The correspondence reads like the diary of a man possessed, each letter revealing deeper levels of obsession and insecurity. "I awake full of you," he wrote from one muddy camp after routing an enemy army. Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures have left no rest to my senses." These weren't the measured communications of a professional soldier to his wife. They were the desperate pleadings of a man who feared that physical distance might translate into emotional abandonment. Napoleon's letters swung wildly between ecstatic devotion and paranoid accusation, often within the same paragraph. He would celebrate a military victory in one sentence and beg Josephine to write more frequently in the next, as if her approval mattered more than the praise of his generals or the fear of his enemies. "Don't wash, I'm coming home," he famously wrote after one particularly successful engagement, a line that reveals how completely he had confused military strategy with romantic desire. Meanwhile, Josephine was enjoying the freedoms that his absence provided, attending Parisian salons, hosting elegant dinner parties, and conducting at least one affair that would later break Napoleon's heart when he discovered it. Her responses to his passionate letters were infrequent, brief, and notably lacking in the emotional intensity that characterized his correspondence. Where he wrote of consuming desire and sleepless nights, she replied with news about social events and requests for money. The contrast between Napoleon's public image and private desperation was stark and psychologically revealing. On the battlefield, he displayed the cool calculation and strategic brilliance that would eventually make him master of Europe. In his letters to Josephine, he was reduced to pleading, threatening, and making promises that had more to do with emotional manipulation than political negotiation. The man who could outmaneuver experienced Austrian generals was helpless against a woman who simply wasn't as invested in their relationship as he was. The correspondence reveals how completely Napoleon had conflated personal and political validation, as if Josephine's love could somehow legitimize his rapidly expanding ambitions. Her indifference struck at insecurities that dated back to his childhood as an outsider in French society, a Corsican whose accent and background marked him as foreign despite his obvious talents. Winning her complete devotion became a campaign more important than any military objective, and her emotional distance left him feeling defeated even as his armies swept across Italy. The letters continue for months, growing more desperate as Napoleon's military successes failed to earn him the romantic victory he truly craved, creating a pattern of emotional dependency that would define their marriage and haunt Napoleon even during his years of imperial glory. Frida Kahlo painted with her blood and wrote love letters with her tears, creating a correspondence with Diego Rivera that was simultaneously the most passionate and most self-destructive romance in the history of art, where every declaration of love was also a meditation on betrayal, and every expression of devotion carried the weight of inevitable heartbreak. The Casa Azul in Coyoacán became the epicenter of a love story that defied every conventional notion of romantic happiness, where two of Mexico's greatest artists created a relationship that was equal parts inspiration and torture, nourishment and poison. Frida's letters to Diego reveal a woman who loved with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion, writing to the man who would repeatedly break her heart with words that transformed pain into poetry and obsession into art. Their relationship began in the 1920s when Frida was a young artist seeking Diego's approval of her work, and he was already Mexico's most famous muralist, a man whose physical presence dominated rooms like a force of nature, and whose appetite for women was as legendary as his artistic genius. He was 20 years older, married to another woman, and notorious for affairs that he conducted with the same public enthusiasm that characterized his political pronouncements. She was recovering from the bus accident that had crushed her spine and would torment her body for the rest of her life, using painting as both physical therapy and emotional outlet. The letters that survived from their courtship and marriage read like dispatches from a war zone, where love and destruction occupied the same territory. "You are my Diego," Frida wrote in one early letter. "I am your Frida." The possessive pronouns carried weight beyond grammar. They represented a claim on identity that went deeper than legal marriage or social convention. For Frida, loving Diego wasn't just an emotion, but a fundamental definition of self, as if her existence could only be validated through his recognition. But Diego's nature made such total devotion a form of slow suicide. His affairs were numerous, public, and conducted with the casual indifference of a man who viewed fidelity as a bourgeois convention that had no place in the life of a revolutionary artist. Frida's letters document each betrayal with the precision of a medical examiner cataloging wounds, yet they also reveal her inability to stop loving the man who was systematically destroying her emotional equilibrium. "I have suffered 2 grave accidents in my life," Frida wrote to a friend. "One in which a streetcar knocked me down, and the other was Diego." The comparison wasn't metaphorical. Both experiences had left her broken and in constant pain, yet unable to imagine existence without the source of her suffering. Her letters to Diego after discovering his most devastating betrayal, an affair with her own sister Cristina, reveal a woman grappling with forgiveness that felt both necessary and impossible. The correspondence intensified during their divorce in 1939, when separation made their emotional dependence more visible rather than less. Frida's letters from this period read like love songs written by someone drowning, beautiful and desperate in equal measure. "I love you more than my own skin," she wrote to Diego during their separation, a line that captures both the intensity of her devotion and the self-destructive nature of a love that prioritized his happiness over her own survival. When they remarried a year later, it was on terms that Diego dictated. He would continue his affairs, and she would accept them as the price of maintaining their connection. Frida's letters from this period reveal a woman who had learned to love around the edges of betrayal, finding ways to sustain passion despite knowing that fidelity was impossible. She wrote to him with the knowledge that other women shared his bed, yet continued to pour out devotion that was both genuine and heartbreaking. The physical pain from her accident and the emotional pain from Diego's infidelities merged in her letters into a single source of suffering that she transformed into artistic material. Her words to him became raw material for paintings that explored love as a form of beautiful destruction, relationships as sites of both creation and annihilation. She wrote to him about pain with the clinical precision of someone who had learned to distinguish between different types of agony. Even as her health deteriorated, and their relationship became increasingly strained by his affairs and her growing political involvement, Frida's letters maintained their tone of desperate devotion. She wrote to him from hospital beds, between surgeries, during periods when painting became physically impossible, using words to maintain the connection that physical presence could no longer sustain. The love that was killing her had also become the thing keeping her alive, a contradiction that she explored in letters that were themselves works of art created from the raw material of impossible love. Ludwig van Beethoven composed symphonies that could move audiences to tears and string quartets that revealed the mathematical beauty underlying human emotion. But the most passionate music he ever created was written in prose. 3 letters addressed to his immortal beloved that were never sent, never signed with a real name, and never solved despite 2 centuries of scholarly detective work that has made them the greatest love mystery in musical history. The letters were discovered among Beethoven's belongings after his death in 1827, carefully preserved in a secret drawer along with other personal documents that the composer had guarded throughout his life. Written in pencil on cheap paper during a brief trip to the Bohemian spa town of Teplitz in 1812, They represent the only completely unguarded emotional expression that survives from a man who spent his public life cultivating an image of artistic genius touched by divine inspiration, but fundamentally removed from ordinary human concerns. The handwriting itself tells a story of emotional turbulence, sometimes flowing smoothly like his most lyrical melodies, other times scratched and corrected as if the composer were struggling to capture feelings that exceeded the capacity of language. My angel, my all, my very self, the first letter begins, immediately establishing an intimacy that Beethoven never displayed in his other correspondence, even with his closest friends and family members. These weren't love letters in the conventional sense of romantic courtship or seduction. They were the desperate communications of a man who had found someone who understood his artistic soul and was being forced by circumstances beyond his control to give her up. The letters reveal that Beethoven and his beloved had been together recently, perhaps even intimately, but were now separated by obstacles that he describes in terms suggesting they were insurmountable rather than temporary. The identity of the immortal beloved has consumed scholars for generations, with candidates including Anthony Brentano, a married aristocrat who was Beethoven's patron and possibly more; Josephine Brunswick, a widowed countess who had exchanged passionate letters with the composer years earlier; and Giulietta Guicciardi, a former piano student whose social status made marriage impossible. Each woman had deep connections to Beethoven's life and work, but none can be definitively linked to the letters through external evidence. What makes the mystery more poignant is the timing. 1812 was the year Beethoven's deafness had progressed to the point where public performance was becoming impossible, when his awareness of his isolation from normal human society was most acute. The letters suggest that he had found someone who could communicate with him despite his hearing loss, who understood his music not just as entertainment but as a spiritual language, and who offered the possibility of emotional connection that transcended his physical limitations. The second letter reveals the depth of his despair at their separation. Much as you love me, I love you more, but do not ever conceal yourself from me. The plea carries the weight of a man who had learned that deafness meant not just the loss of sound, but the loss of spontaneous human connection, who had discovered that most people either pitied his condition or were intimidated by his artistic reputation. The final letter, written the following morning, shows Beethoven attempting to find acceptance through what sounds like a combination of romantic philosophy and personal anguish. Love demands everything, and that very justly. Thus it is to me with you and to you with me. But you forget so easily that I must live for me and for you. If we were wholly united, you would feel the pain of it as little as I. The letters were never sent, suggesting that Beethoven either lost his nerve or concluded that the relationship could never be consummated without destroying one or both of their lives. The woman remained anonymous, perhaps because naming her would have compromised her reputation, or because Beethoven understood that some loves are too precious to risk exposing to public scrutiny and social judgment. What transforms these letters from historical curiosity to artistic achievement is how they reveal the emotional landscape that produced some of Beethoven's greatest compositions. The passionate intensity, the struggle between hope and despair, the sense of love as both salvation and torment. These themes that appear throughout his late works suddenly become recognizable as autobiographical rather than abstract. The immortal beloved remains immortal precisely because she was never named, never claimed, never reduced to the biographical facts that would have made her merely human. She exists in the space between music and language, representing the perfect love that inspired art, even as it remained forever beyond reach. Oscar Wilde wrote the longest love letter in literary history from a prison cell, 50,000 words of passion, recrimination, and philosophical meditation, addressed to the beautiful young aristocrat whose selfishness had destroyed the most celebrated wit of the Victorian era, transforming what should have been a breakup note into a masterpiece of psychological analysis that revealed how love and destruction could occupy the same emotional territory. Reading Gaol in 1897 was not designed for literary composition. It was a place where the British government sent men whose crimes against public morality required punishment that was both physical and psychological. Wilde had been sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for gross indecency, the Victorian legal euphemism for homosexual relationships that could not be named directly in polite society. His cell was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small table, yet it was here that he produced De Profundis, a letter that began as an attempt to make sense of his catastrophic relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas and evolved into a meditation on suffering, art, and the possibility of redemption. Lord Alfred Douglas, known to his intimates as Bosie, was everything that should have warned a more prudent man away from romantic entanglement. Breathtakingly beautiful, thoroughly spoiled, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. He was 22 years younger than Wilde, the son of the Marquess of Queensberry, and utterly convinced that his aristocratic birth granted him immunity from the ordinary rules that governed other people's behavior. Their relationship had been both intensely passionate and systematically destructive, a 3-year romance that combined genuine intellectual connection with Bosie's talent for emotional manipulation and financial exploitation. Wilde, at the height of his fame as a playwright and wit, had lavished money, attention, and devotion on a young man who accepted all three as his natural due, while contributing little beyond his beauty and the dangerous excitement that came from their illegal liaison. The letter that Wilde composed in prison swings between devastating psychological analysis and expressions of love so tender they seem to have been written about an entirely different person. "You came to me to learn the pleasure of life and the pleasure of art," he writes to Bosie. "Perhaps I am chosen to teach you something much more wonderful, the meaning of sorrow and its beauty." The tone suggests a teacher addressing a pupil, but also a parent speaking to a beloved but wayward child. What makes De Profundis more than just an exercise in romantic self-pity is Wilde's ruthless examination of his own complicity in the relationship's toxicity. He acknowledges that he had been attracted not just to Bosie's beauty but to his capacity for selfishness, that there had been something in the young man's moral emptiness that had appealed to Wilde's own appetite for aesthetic experience divorced from ethical consideration. The one charm of marriage is that it makes a life of deception absolutely necessary for both parties, he had written in one of his plays, and his relationship with Bosie had provided deception on an epic scale. The letter documents with clinical precision how Bosie had systematically drained Wilde's finances, demanding expensive gifts, luxurious accommodations, and constant entertainment while contributing nothing to their household except his presence and periodic tantrums when his demands weren't met quickly enough. More damaging still was Bosie's talent for involving Wilde in situations that compromised his reputation and legal safety, introducing him to blackmailers, rent boys, and social situations that eventually provided the evidence used to convict him. Yet even as Wilde catalogs these betrayals and recognizes the relationship's destructive pattern, he cannot stop loving the man who had ruined his life. "I must forgive you," he writes, "not because Bosie deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to resentment would have completed the spiritual destruction that prison had begun." The letter becomes a document of self-liberation, achieved through the paradoxical act of loving someone who had proven himself incapable of returning that love responsibly. The final sections of De Profundis reveal Wilde transforming his personal catastrophe into artistic material, finding in his experience of love, betrayal, and imprisonment the raw material for a new understanding of how suffering could be transformed into wisdom. He had entered prison as a man who used his wit to avoid serious engagement with life's deeper questions. He emerged as someone who understood that the aesthetic philosophy that had guided his career was insufficient for navigating the actual consequences of moral choices. When Wilde finally sent portions of the letter to Bosie after his release, their relationship was beyond repair. But the document itself had become something larger than personal correspondence, a work of art created from the ashes of impossible love. In our digital age of instant messages, fleeting texts, and ephemeral social media posts, the handwritten love letters of history stand as monuments to a time when romance required patience, when passion was crafted rather than spontaneous, and when declaring love meant taking the time to choose words that could survive centuries and still make hearts skip beats in readers who were born long after the ink had dried. These letters represent more than personal correspondence. They are time capsules of human emotion that reveal how little the fundamental experience of love has changed despite all our technological advances. Napoleon's desperate pleading from Italian battlefields, Frida's anguished devotion despite Diego's betrayals, Beethoven's mysterious passion for his unnamed beloved, and Wilde's philosophical transformation of heartbreak into art, all speak to experiences that modern lovers recognize immediately, even when separated by centuries and cultural revolutions. What makes these historical love letters particularly powerful is their permanence in an era when most romantic communication leaves no lasting trace. Today's lovers express their feelings through mediums designed to disappear. Text messages that get deleted, social media posts that get buried in feeds, digital photos that vanish when relationships end. But these historical correspondences were created with the understanding that words written in ink carried weight and permanence, that declaring love in writing was simultaneously an act of faith and a form of artistic creation. The physical act of writing these letters reveals something about love itself that our current technology obscures. Napoleon had to stop between military campaigns to compose his desperate messages to Josephine, using precious time that could have been devoted to strategic planning or rest to craft expressions of longing that reveal more about his character than any military memoir. Frida painted with brushes while her spine was fused with metal rods, yet found the physical strength to write to Diego because the emotional need to communicate transcended bodily limitation. The survival of these letters also speaks to their recipients' recognition that they were receiving something more valuable than personal communication. They were being entrusted with documents that captured the writers at their most vulnerable and authentic. Even when relationships ended badly, as most of these did, the letters were preserved because they represented evidence of love's capacity to inspire extraordinary expression, proof that human beings could achieve something approaching artistic transcendence through the simple act of writing about their feelings. Modern readers are drawn to these letters not because they represent an idealized past when love was simpler, but because they demonstrate how writing can transform raw emotion into something that outlasts the circumstances that created it. Napoleon's empire fell, his marriage to Josephine ended in divorce, and he died in exile. But his letters continue to move readers because they capture universal experiences of desire, insecurity, and romantic obsession, with a directness that political memoir could never achieve. The literary quality of these letters also reveals how love has historically pushed people beyond their normal capacities for expression. Beethoven, who struggled with ordinary social interaction due to his deafness, found in his letters to the immortal beloved a voice of perfect emotional clarity. Wilde, imprisoned and financially ruined, used his letter to Bosie to create one of the most psychologically sophisticated analyses of destructive love ever written. The extremity of their circumstances seemed to liberate them from the conventional constraints that limited their other writing. Perhaps most importantly, these letters remind us that love itself is a form of artistic creation, an ongoing process of trying to capture in language something that exceeds the capacity of words. The writers weren't just communicating with their beloved, they were attempting to create permanent records of temporary feelings, to build monuments from emotions that they understood were both precious and fragile. In an era when romantic relationships often end with the simple act of blocking someone on social media, these historical love letters offer evidence of a different approach to ending, one that involved wrestling with contradictions, seeking understanding, and sometimes achieving a kind of wisdom that transformed personal experience into universal truth. They suggest that the most important thing about love may not be its happiness or its duration, but its capacity to inspire us to become more articulate, more honest, and more human than we thought possible. The ink has faded, the paper has yellowed, but the emotions preserved in these letters continue to pulse with life, reminding us that some forms of communication are too important to leave to the convenience of modern technology. And there you have it. From Henry VIII's royal decomposition to love letters that outlasted empires, tonight's journey through history's most human moments proves that even legends had embarrassing bodily functions, scandalous affairs, and hearts that broke just like ours. We've seen how power can't protect you from your own biology, how empresses can be undone by their own ambition, how founding fathers were just as messy as the rest of us, and how the greatest love stories often came with the highest costs. These aren't just dusty tales from textbooks, they're reminders that behind every marble statue and noble portrait was a real person dealing with leaky bodies, impossible relationships, and decisions that would haunt them forever. History becomes infinitely more interesting when you realize that Caesar probably had digestive issues, and Shakespeare definitely knew some juicy gossip. If tonight's exploration of history's messier side helped you drift off with a smile, hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories that prove the past was way weirder than anyone wants to admit. We'll continue diving into the secrets, scandals, and surprisingly relatable disasters of famous figures who were just trying to figure things out, one questionable decision at a time. Next week, we're exploring the bizarre medical treatments that nearly killed more patients than diseases. Perfect bedtime material for anyone who's ever complained about a doctor's visit. Sweet dreams, and remember, no matter how bad your day was, at least your coffin isn't leaking.